Welcome everyone to a discussion about where volunteer engagement fits in the move to eliminate systemic racism. This session is part of the 34th Maine Volunteer Leadership Conference, but we realize that you may be viewing this at another time and appreciate your desire to explore these issues. My name is Marge Kilkelly, and I will moderate the discussion. I currently work as a policy manager for the Maine Primary Care Association, but I've had many roles in the nonprofit and government world, beginning as a Head Start director, serving in the Maine legislature, and more recently serving as senior policy advisor to Senator Angus King. I am very honored to have been invited to facilitate this critical conversation. The four panelists joining us today will help explore the issues of equity, inclusion, and racism as they relate to civic engagement and volunteer engagement in Maine. Now is a time when leaders of all community activities are called to change, to be more inclusive, and to rethink fundamentals. The panelists joining me are Natalye Paquin, President of the Points of Light Institute, Lelia DeAndrade, Vice President of Community Impact, Maine Community Foundation, Reverend Jane Field, Executive Director of the Maine Council of Churches, and Ian Yaffe, Executive Director of Mano a Mano. Since the expanded bios are on the website, I would ask the guests to briefly talk about the highlights of the work that you're currently doing. And we will start with Natalye Paquin from the Points of Light Institute. Thank you, Natalye.
Hello, Marge, and thank you for inviting Points of Light to join this really important conversation. Points of Light is a nonprofit global network of nonprofit organizations. We have corporations and individuals that are really involved in making their community better. Our mission is to inspire, equip, and mobilize people to take action and change. We are in over 200 cities and 37 countries, and each year with the support of our partners, we actually mobilize over 5 million individuals who are basically doing good in their community. We're really excited about this period of time that we're in because we believe it is really a shining example of the power of people and people coming together using their power, whether it is their voice, their purchase power, getting out to vote, where they choose to work, but using all of these different areas of individual power to make a difference.
So I am the Vice President of Community Impact at the Maine Community Foundation. That means I oversee all of our competitive grant programs, our scholarship programs, and our strategic initiatives, one of which is a focus on racial equity. We're a statewide community foundation, and our mission is to improve the quality of life for all Maine people.
Reverend Jane Field from the Maine Council of Churches.
Yes, we're an organization that's also statewide, and we represent 7 mainline Protestant denominations that have about 430 congregations spread across our state with about 55,000 members. Marge happens to sit on our board right now, so we know each other in that capacity as well. Our mission is to inspire people of faith and goodwill and congregations to build a culture of compassion, justice, and peace. We do that mainly through programming and public policy advocacy.
Thank you so much. Ian Yaffe from Mano a Mano.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ian. I work with Mano a Mano. We're an organization that is based in Down East Maine in Washington County. We primarily work with immigrant and farm worker communities in that region. We provide a variety of different types of services and activities, including access to basic needs and resources, community building and advocacy, education, and housing. And we also are the statewide provider of services with the migrant education program through the Maine Department of Education. So our primary activities are in the Down East region, but we do have a statewide presence for migrant families who are here in Maine year-round or seasonally working in agriculture or fishing.
Thank you so much. Well, to start things off, Lelia, from a statewide perspective, since May of 2020, what do you see as the status of awareness and change in Maine from nonprofits regarding addressing racism and inequity?
It's hard to tell where we are right now, given the situation with COVID and this massive amount of attention that's been given to racial equity. My experience has been, however, that around the state, in many places in the state, people don't believe that race is an issue here. They go to Maine as the whitest state in the country, and so that leads them to believe that there's no problem with racism. People often say we don't have people of race of color here, which is always funny when they say that to me because I'm here. And they believe that it's a Southern Maine urban issue, that it only happens in Portland and Lewiston, and they forget that people of color live all over the state, and we have really well documented disparities related to race. The situation may have changed when Maine got on the national map for having the highest rates of disparities around COVID and of color, but mostly I see a concentration of attention in places and a lot of other people thinking that not so much our issue.
Thank you. Ian, I'm going to ask you, news reports and speakers, and certainly Lelia just talked about the fact that, you know, Maine is often cited as the whitest and least diverse in the state, but another view is that those words are pretty hurtful. Because they dismiss the people that are here and they sort of limit the need for awareness because it's denied. Is that the experience that you've had as well with the folks that you're working with?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Lelia shared. The situation, I think people, yes, like Maine is the whitest. We compete with Vermont on like who wants to be the whitest state. But the narrative here is like as if that is true for all of history, when Maine has been one of the whitest states in the United States for a couple hundred years maybe, and by no accident. And so that is especially, it's harmful everywhere. It's not like more harmful in rural Maine and less harmful in Portland. But I think the big issue with that is that I think only white people really get to claim the title of being a Mainer in the public narrative. And so we work with community members who aren't immigrant, but they get labeled immigrants because of the color of their skin or because of their culture. And I think there's this notion that people from away are worth less as a general matter of like common language in Maine, which is especially harmful for people who are never gonna get to look like they're from here because of the narrative of who is from here. But the reality is that you have people of color have been in Maine for hundreds of years. And this used to be a majority people of color state back when it was actually Wabanaki land, and that was taken away. So there's just so much to unpack there. But it is a really harmful narrative that continues to undervalue the experience that people of color have living here in Maine and their role in Maine's history and in Maine's community development and sense of culture and place. So I will pause. There's a lot.
That's a really interesting point that you raise in terms of the language we use, because growing up in Maine, the language is always people from away, and that, you know, does have its distinctions. And I guess I had never really thought about how that adds an additional layer for people who, people who are of color who are not going to sort of blend in at some point in time. But it is language we use. And I think that's part of the difficulty of this issue, is that some of it really is unthinking and unlearning things that many of us grew up with. So. Natalye, from the Points of Light Institute, you're a national leader, obviously international leader in volunteer and service. What's the discussion and thinking about this issue around the country at this point in time?
Yeah, sure, Marge. And, I would begin by saying that community is queen. And it's really important for people to understand and know their community because the challenges and opportunities and benefits that exist in every community when there is a crisis or when there is a spotlight on your community, those issues become exaggerated. And so, what we are really reinforcing, while we may have global strategies, all actions happen locally, is for people to understand and really get to know their community because, that's where the superpowers are. I think in my opening statement, I also talked about what we call civic engagement and how people are getting involved. And so we are, really evolving from not just volunteerism, but other ways people can move an agenda or improve your community. And it is through your voice, through your purchase power, through volunteerism as well. But I think the primary point is to really get to know your community.
Excellent. And Jane, speaking of communities, many of the community volunteer efforts are from faith-based communities. And what do you think some of the critical questions are for those volunteer leaders regarding the people that they're working with to deal with equity, inclusion, and racism?
Thanks, Marge. I think that for the most part, I know that for the most part, the denominations represented by our council are overwhelmingly white. And so it's easy for them to fall into the traps that have been identified by Lelia and Ian and you, saying, it's not our problem. There aren't any white folks. I mean, there aren't any people of color here. We're all white folks. And so you said something a moment ago, Marge, about learning how to unlearn things. And for our faith communities, I think a first step in making the programming and the work that they do within their walls and beyond them is doing that unlearning work and not looking to people of color to do it for them or to educate them, but to do their own work. And we at the council have been trying to encourage local congregations to do that. There are excellent resources available. We as a board for 2 years, as Marge knows, 30 minutes of every meeting plus homework in between was devoted to equity, inclusion, and systemic racism study, as well as looking at our own white privilege. And almost instantly it began impacting the way we did programs. It was a lens through which we looked at things differently that we looked at for decades, like civil discourse. Suddenly we stopped and heard our siblings of color saying, when you white folks say be civil, we hear you saying be quiet and sit down. And that's racist, and that perpetuates the status quo of white supremacy. Stop doing that. We wouldn't have known that if we hadn't done our work. And so I really, another thing that Ian said that really struck home with me was understanding that if you are not Wabanaki, you are from away. And until you start acknowledging that, in your worship, in your programming, we are standing on Wabanaki land. We are the people from away, and they were a majority. They were 100% majority people of color before we came and did the atrocities that we did. And getting honest about that will change the way we are a church. And I think that's got to happen.
One of the things that is maybe easier in this conversation is to look at the community or look at others and say, you know, well, here's I have an awareness of racial inequity or bias in the community. It's always harder to look at your own organization or to look at yourself and find those issues. For any of you, what advice or models do you have for an organization that is really ready for that kind of self-evaluation and potentially change? And anybody want to go first?
I think it's really important for organizations not to try to do it on their own, to engage with somebody who has expertise, because we are swimming in a lake of racism and institutional racism, and it's very, very hard to see. And oftentimes if people don't get guidance, they kind of fall into a mode of white fragility where there's a lot of guilt and hand-wringing and not a lot of progress. And so I think it's really important for organizations who want to start this work to get some professional guidance.
Yes, so I will agree with Lelia that bringing in an expert for a conversation and to learn and to grow in this space is really, really important. And then behind bringing in an expert, there are a couple of areas or a couple of how we describe it, steps that we think are important. And one is to listen, and the listening is with sincerity of learning. And so it's listen, learn, and then have a commitment to take action. So it's listen, learn, act. And then there must be a commitment also for sustainability. How do you sustain whatever good and positive actions you have taken?
Excellent. Others?
Yeah, Marge, I think I want to just clarify, because I think what Lelia and Natalye are saying is so important. And in church world where I live, each of the 7 denominations has created a curriculum that does use professional expertise. So that's what we encourage local congregations to take advantage of. I would imagine other areas have similar things, but to tap into those and not just think you should make something up from scratch, because that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I don't have anything I would really add here. I think the points that have been shared are really important. And well, I guess then I do have something to add. And I would say, like, for a lot of organizations, especially right now, where like anti-racism is like almost trendy, like, I think sometimes there's like a false expectation that this is all about training and talking. And it is about training and talking and learning. But racism operates at like multiple levels, at personal, interpersonal, organization, and systemic. And so at the end of the day, some of this is also about power and resources. And that part isn't supposed to be easy. And it's also not supposed to, it's not supposed to be like, it's not supposed to say that our goal here is that everybody has the same power and resources at the end of the process. Part of this is about transferring power and resources to people and communities who have had those power and resources taken from them for generations. And it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but it's also not a, we'll just grow our way out of the problem game.
And actually, based on something that I think it was Natalye said earlier, I mean, certainly the by understanding your community and growing and working with other people in your community, you actually strengthen the community, and everyone is stronger because of using every person as a resource, or accepting that every person is a resource, and somebody that you can learn from and work with and teach to, and just, you know, be there. And I think that certainly strengthens communities. How important do any of you believe it is for a group of volunteers to reflect the community they serve, and how do you think that impacts the service that's provided? Jane, you're nodding vigorously. Right there.
We struggle with this because currently our board is all white, and we recognize that that is not okay. And we recognize the problem of tokenism. And I don't have an answer for how to fix that or how to move forward through that reality, but we're working on it. And I think a lot of organizations in Maine probably have some of those same struggles. Maybe Lelia, through her work with nonprofits, has a broader perspective.
Yeah, you know, this is something that we hold as a high standard. You're not serving the community unless you reflect the community. And as Jane said, the tokenism is an issue. Part of the dynamic here is that we've had this long system of segregation based on race. And so if you're not stretching to look for people and you're white, you're not going to find them. You have to really be intentional. And that doesn't mean calling your one friend of color and asking them who you can nominate, but really going out and making an effort to know who's in your community. And not just with people of color, with people who are living in poverty, people with different access to resources. You need to be active and engaged. I cannot tell you how many boards I've been invited to be on, and when I say why, they say, we're looking for diversity. And nobody wants to be at the table because they represent a different color pillow to decorate your room. So that's why I'm never excited when people talk about diversity. I'm always interested in how people talk about equity. But it takes work. It's not easy, and you've got to be creative and sincere about why you want people at the table. And it can't be for their color. It has to be for the perspectives they bring.
I'd like to jump in and add to that, and thank you, Lelia, for those comments, and thank you also, Jane, for your initial comments. And I'll start with a couple of comments. One is about the difference between bias and a preference, and sometimes we have preferences. And those preferences become so strong that it's the other side of a coin of bias. So if I have a preference for polka dots, and Marge, you're wearing stripes, my preference for polka dots, eventually, if I'm at a party and I'm looking for everyone who's wearing polka dots, but I don't want to have a conversation with anyone who's wearing stripes, my preference for polka dots actually could become a bias against stripes. And so I do think that, language matters, and it may be easier for people to understand their preferences and the impact of their preferences as opposed to a bias. And so I just would point that out. And then when we talk about having people from the community, around the community, one of the things that we want to remember is everyone has an asset, and they use their assets to unlock the assets of others. And so as we are looking to solve problems in communities, we would not want people who live in communities to believe, and hopefully we don't believe, that they have assets that could be used and leveraged to help solve the problems or make a community better. And so I do think that it is important, not just for diversity of perspective, but it is because everyone is bringing some asset, and we want people to feel like the solution is accessible to them.
And that they're valued.
Yes, of course.
Absolutely. Ian, any comments on that?
For us, I think really one of the keys here is building relationships with community members that are based on strengths, like Natalie's mentioning, and that are based on self-determination. And so we believe that the communities that we work with have the solutions to the challenges that they're facing, and not that we need some group of folks from outside to come in and tell them what is best for them. In terms of working with volunteers, we certainly have experience working with volunteers who are from the communities that we work with, and we have experience working with volunteers who are not. And I think it's a different it's just a very different relationship, and it takes a lot more work for volunteers who aren't part of a community that they're working with to take that initiative to move it beyond transactional, like move it beyond I'm doing something to feel good, to moving it into like I'm here to build relationships with folks who are in my community. And I'm here to offer some sort of strength and to learn, but not as a one-way street.
It's interesting. This conversation reminds me of a friend of mine years ago who made a comment about sort of people moving in and kind of taking over a community, and said they act just like we've been sitting here waiting for them. And that, I think that can be a trap where it's, we're coming in, people are coming in and saying, this is what needs to happen. This is the right way to do things. This is how to do it, as opposed to listening, as opposed to understanding the challenges that people are facing. And as you say, the assets that they're bringing into that conversation, for sure. Yeah, I think it's the listening part of it is so critically important. And talking about inclusion, one of the things that that is interesting in terms of volunteerism is the ability to volunteer, or the knowledge of how and where to volunteer, is often limited to people with a history of that experience. And the other night I was thinking in particular about arts, that there are lots of very gifted young people who are interested in the arts, but maybe their families haven't been able to afford a museum entrance fee, or maybe their family doesn't have an experience visiting a museum. And they would be wonderful. It would be a great experience for them. And I'm wondering if there are efforts or programs to really do that kind of, as you say, hard outreach to people and invite them, and maybe even support them with a stipend if that's what's necessary to help people volunteer, in order to use that volunteer experience for personal enrichment, and then they can share that within their community as well. Any thoughts about that in terms of the challenges of doing that kind of outreach?
Hey Marge, I actually will politely challenge the structure of the question. And I challenge the structure of the question based on research. I actually worked in the arts in Philadelphia a number of years, and the Philadelphia Cultural Alliance actually conducted some research, and that research was supported by the Pew Foundation, and it was about the consumption of art and the arts by community. And I think the first report was called Portfolio, and so you'd have to really go and dig for it. But one of the things that was learned or discovered or teased out was that minority communities actually consumed and participated in the arts at greater rates than the majority communities. It was just how the majority community described or defined participation in the arts, how they described and defined consumption of the arts, and what arts, in air quotes, they were presenting as important for consumption. And so, I would challenge the question around getting communities to consume or participate in the arts, and really maybe suggest having conversations with the community about the arts and cultural experiences that are meaningful to them, that they are participating in, and where the connection could be between the arts that you are asking for attention to, and the arts and cultural experiences that are already being had in those communities.
And I would love to extend that to volunteerism, because there's a sense of this formal relationship of volunteerism, and the idea that the people who volunteer are the people who have the time and money to volunteer. And so the image of a volunteer becomes an older white middle class person, rather than understanding that there's a deep, deep history and culture of volunteerism around in all sorts of communities and cultures. It may not be a formal structure of I'm signing in with this organization, but people do for each other for free in communities of color all over the state, and in poor communities where those are the people who we don't think of as volunteers. And so if you're not engaging people who come from different experiences and perspectives, especially people of color, it's not because they don't volunteer, it's because their way of engaging with volunteerism might be different than what you expect. And it should push you to think about what it means to be a volunteer for your organization.
Excellent points. And it's really important for all of us to be learning. So I appreciate the pushback, because I think that's exactly what this conversation is about, and understanding the difference in terms of definitions and how we see something is the first step to how we learn to talk about it differently. So thank you. Other thoughts on that? If not, if you could build an inclusive program from scratch, what would be the critical elements of that organization and operation?
I'll just go back to the importance of equity rather than inclusion, that making sure that people have equal access to power and resources is key. And so if you front load equity, inclusion will follow.
I think I would speak on being intentional about erasing the sidelines and removing barriers. And so if you begin with a conversation about what it takes, like what will it take for you to be more engaged, if you want to be more engaged, what will it take for us to leverage and have access to your talents and your perspectives and all of the assets that you have that could unlock the assets of ours and of others. So learning about the barriers to entry, the barriers to participation, and then committing to removing those barriers, I think that's where I would start.
Natalie, I'm going to totally steal that asset analogy. I love that.
Yeah, that's great. I actually am on a working group of Generosity Commission, and we're looking at, how do you define generosity, and and philanthropy too. And so, typically it is about wealth and financial assets that people have, but we know that everyone has an asset, even if it is your voice, and you can use your asset to unlock the assets of others. And so we would never want generosity, volunteerism, anything that is supporting a community to be inaccessible to everyone, right? And so it's all accessible to everyone if we all know that we have something to offer.
And I promise I won't steal it without attributing it to you.
That's fine. Thanks, Lelia.
It's so beautiful to hear that language now in such a difficult time. It made me smile.
Great, thank you.
If the tenets around giving at the church that I go to is the whole issue of time, treasure, and talent. And I've often talked about it like the tide, that there are times when the tide is full and you've got the treasure to provide, or you've got the time to provide. And there are other times when the flow is ebbed and you don't have that, but other people come in. And I think that sort of expresses that whole sense of there are lots of ways to support each other. And there are times when we can do different things. And that is also a really important aspect of it.
I think with that, in approaching any organizational work, especially, engaging volunteers or getting into like nonprofits and things like that, really thinking about that idea of assets, and from the very beginning, like which Natalie's talking about. And so much of what we hear in volunteerism and philanthropy is all about deficits. And so we view like the communities that Mano works with immigrants, farm workers, people of color, those communities are viewed as having deficits that need to be like filled by philanthropy or by volunteers, rather than thinking about all of the strengths that those communities already have, and how you can use strengths yourself to help build the strengths, build up, like building everybody up instead of saying we need to fill this up. And I think it's a real challenge for Maine, to be honest with you, that we're just not really in that environment right now, in the way that our politics and our policies and our resources flow. And it really causes a lot of continual harm, while the solutions are at the same time right in front of us.
Could you talk more about the power and resources, and what you would like to see happening?
That's a complicated one. I think at the end of the day, we get into very basic questions around whose time is valued, whose labor is valued, whose communities are valued, in pretty real and tangible ways when it comes to at least money, access to opportunities. It's financial and non-financial resources. But all of those resources are still sort of predicated on a model where a certain groups of people, the way that they do things, the way that the labor that happens is valued more than other groups of people. And so in this case, it gets into real questions about access to living wage, to healthcare, to a place to live, and who has the right to those things in the state of Maine and who doesn't. And that's not to say that we don't have enough resources. It's just that they're being allocated in a way that systematically causes harm to some folks and systematically uplifts other folks along racial lines. And that's not the fault of white people today. Like, this didn't get built over the past 4 years or 10 years or 50 years. But at some point we have to own the impact and not the intent.
Well said. I think Natalie's comment about dismantling barriers, that's when the rubber meets the road, right? And what Ian's talking about, when you dismantle the status quo that privileges some, suddenly it gets hard and people resist, and we're not going to book club our way out of this. I heard one person say recently, and it's fine to sit and read a book and sip some tea and talk about it. But when you start talking about that kind of hard look at what do we need to change about the status quo, that we ought to be ready for a long, well, it has been long, it's been 400 years, and it's not going to get fixed in 10 more. Because to relinquish privilege is not an easy thing for people to do. That's why this has lasted so long, this systemic privilege or oppression based on skin color and race.
Yeah, hey Jane, I wouldn't approach it as relinquishing privilege, because I think everybody wants privilege. It's all of us having privilege.
Yeah, sharing privilege.
Right. It's not relinquishing, I do think that we have to be a little bit more fluent in the benefits of equity, and for all, and why and how it makes a better and stronger society.
Because I spent a lot of time in the public policy advocacy world, it's always the model, and this is about dismantling my own assumptions, but the model always is scarce resources. The pie only gets cut up certain ways, and so if you get more, I get less. That tends to be the worldview that defines so much of the policy debate. And your way of reframing may be the way out of that dead end.
It certainly is a challenge, and one that I think all of us need to be aware of. And I do like the idea of, as we're changing how we look at things and changing the language we use, that it's somewhat incremental, but every step forward is a step forward, and it's important. Do you think there's a big difference in the approach to some of the issues, that there's a difference between community groups that primarily are advocates for change and those that have a mission to meet basic needs like food, shelter, or healthcare, how they go about doing the work that they do? Or should there be a difference? Maybe there shouldn't be a difference.
I'll jump in. I think that it's all moving towards good. And if you are, if health or the environment, whatever your issue is, it is for change, and it is to improve the conditions for all. And so I see it as the same direction on a continuum.
Well, I like you're all moving towards good. I think a lot of your statements are going to get captured and reused by the group because they're really wonderful. Thank you. And attributed. So, Jane?
Yeah, they are. They're great. I've been writing as fast as I can write, as all of you have been talking. I've noticed a shift in Augusta in the last 2 legislative cycles that I think is a really positive step forward, moving toward good for all, particularly with the way Maine Equal Justice is doing their work, and they're a significant secular partner of ours in the advocacy world. And that is not to have the policy wonks and the well-meaning white folks step in to testify and say, this is a matter of justice, and it is, of course it is, but they're privileging and positioning the voices of those directly impacted to speak to that reality in the first person. And it changes the room, it changes the dynamic, it changes the conversation to do that. And it's the right thing to do. And I think it echoes some of what's been lifted up in this conversation earlier, is hearing those voices and not speaking for them. I no longer say I speak on behalf of. That is not as helpful as even language is so important in all of this. Equipping and getting out of the way, stepping back so others can step forward and speak for themselves, doing what I need to do to make sure that that's possible for them to do.
Yeah, I feel like for me, the distinction between advocacy and basic needs can feel like a trap at times, and that it's not, it's really not an either or, it's a both and type of thing. And so the question, especially really the question is like, what do communities need right now? And what do communities need 10 years from now? And how do you work on both of those questions at the same time? You can't ignore, like Mano and Mano can't just say like, okay, we're like done with the basic needs game, because that's not helpful at this moment. We need to be doing advocacy. That doesn't help anybody the same way that if we said we're gonna ignore systemic oppression and just be like, well, we got this thing today, that's not gonna help. The question that I think often comes at the organization level is how much are you using these distinctions to justify like what I would call like system maintenance work of like, we're just gonna keep everything going good enough so that some people can survive. but we're really just like 50 years from now going to be looking at the same thing. And again, it's not an either or situation. And I feel like at times, many of the organizations that we work with who focus on basic needs are a little bit, they give up a little bit too easily on the idea that there's also systemic change that they need to be a part of. And that doesn't mean testifying in Augusta. That's not the only way to achieve systemic change. It's probably one of the most frustrating ways. But you just can't ignore the work that has to be done, systemic change at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. It's all necessary. And the organizations in particular that are in that basic needs, basic resources situation have a real obligation to examine the systems that put them there and the amount of power and resources that they get as being the intermediary.
Yeah, Ian, I'm so glad that you said that, because I was struggling to think about advocacy versus basic needs. And so many of the organizations that I work with, I think of them as doing both. But I think that comes, it's kind of pushing back against this idea that advocacy happens in Augusta or advocacy happens at the City Hall. And you know, we've been having these really interesting conversations in Portland about, you know, going to the city council to talk about the changes that need to be made. And that kind of advocacy is not comfortable for lots of people. And those structures are not set up to be welcoming. So those of us who have the courage, or those of you who have the courage to do that, can go into those situations and push for change and feel like you're beating your head against the wall. And then other organizations and other people who feel less like that kind of formal vision of advocacy can advocate and push for the rights of people in different kinds of ways.
And it also, as you're talking, it just sounds like, again, because there's so much that needs to be done and it's so broad and in many cases so deep, that the idea of collaboration and communication among all of those different organizations, so that in fact we're all moving to good, and not undercutting each other or duplicating when you know, when we do have limited time and resources in order to do this work. But if everybody is doing the part that they can and communicating that well, it certainly, I think, helps to move things forward, if that makes sense. We all do different things. What is it that you would like the people that are viewing this discussion to come away with? If you had sort of 2 points that you really, really want them to hear and to come away with, what would those 2 points be?
I think it's easy for me. I want them to hold on to Natalie's concept of people as assets, unlocking other assets.
I would say that you are enough. Like it's the same thing. At Points of Light, we believe that every action matters. We believe in the power of people. We believe that no act is too small. I personally believe in converting connections to currency. And, you know, so this is, I actually picked up the idea from Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point. I think Lois Weisberg, somewhere in that book, talks about connections and how you convert those connections to currency. And so a currency is anything of value to you. So it could be someone making a phone call for you or inviting you to a particular, you know, meeting or event that someone else is going to be, where someone else is going to be. I think, you know, if you go back to the assets, if you go back to that you are enough, if you go back to what you have, converting that into something else, that no act is too small and that every action matters. Yeah, March, those would be the two things I would suggest.
It's okay to have more.
I might not have two things, but I would just, for everybody that's listening on this, I would encourage you to take a personal stake here and to realize that the harm, as we talk about the harm that racism, classism cause to people of color and to poor people, to recognize that there's also harm being caused to white people and middle class people. These same systems are holding us all back, even if they have disproportionate impact. I'm not trying to say that but just really to take a personal stake in this and to realize that your future depends on it as much as everybody else's.
In listening to Ian and Lelia and Natalye through my own particular lens as somebody who speaks theologically to people, the word humility keeps coming up for me, that it's an essential piece of what particularly the overprivileged need to enter this space with. The other word that has come up over and over in this hour is listening. Not to the exclusion of action, never to the exclusion of action, but that listening has to be a first step. And if you're listening with humility, then the actions, however small, as Natalye said, might be taken, will make a difference for the good.
So for any of you, are there programs that you think of as being just really shining examples of inclusion and doing great work that folks ought to be looking at as a way for them to evaluate the things that they're doing?
Again, I would encourage, when I go back to the community as queen, right? I would encourage us to look within and look around our own community and not always think that someone else has a better idea, but look to what's happening well in your community, because context matters. I could talk about, a few national programs that we have and national partners that we have, and I'm happy to share that at another time. But I do think for the people who are joining us and who really are looking for what to do next, there is excellence right in your community. Have a conversation with the leaders there, and yeah, so I would say just look right around you and find that and model that and find what can be scaled and modeled for more success.
Then obviously that would fit the community because it's from the community, which makes a great deal.
Yes.
Two that popped into my head, and there are many here in Maine. One is the Four Directions Development Corporation that works to develop affordable housing for the Wabanaki tribes and does it with them, not for them. Their model in some ways is a lot like the microloan model that a lot of people are familiar with internationally as well as domestically. And the other is Yarmouth Compassionate Housing, right up the road here from Portland, doing small scale, local, highly local work in housing newly arrived immigrants and asylum seekers with local families, and then weaving together a sense of community where those folks stay and become part of the community and bring their assets into that setting and that context in amazingly beautiful and powerful ways, family by family. So those are two that just occurred to me.
I know that Ian won't toot his own horn, but I can say that I've watched Mano a Mano do just amazing work in really understanding the needs of the communities that they're serving and engaging with people to find out what they're doing and how to amplify it. It's been a model for me for 12 years. When I first started the Community Foundation, I learned about it. And watching the housing get developed by mano a mano, and then the evolution of the educational programs, it's an amazing, really, truly grassroots organization.
Well, thanks, Lelia. I would definitely, I would say for a lot of folks, just knowing that mano a mano is not, it's not only me, that really my role is here as a facilitator, and to really uplift the community leaders and our staff leaders and board leaders who have been doing this for 20 years and who continue to guide and move us forward, in a lot of different ways. I don't have there's just so many things. I really like your point, Natalie, of really looking locally and trying to find excellence where you are, and that excellence is always going to be somewhere else. And so I think that would be for the folks here, really just doing that work into finding spaces that feel vibrant, spaces that feel inclusive. There's not really a magic checklist for that, but you know it when you're there. When you can be yourself in a room, you can feel it. And so that's where I'll leave it for now. Thank you.
I think it's interesting because certainly I think our natural inclination, as Natalie pointed out, is always to look out. And I think that's particularly true in Maine, where people tend to look to someone else to have the answers, where I think we're not always as comfortable with our homegrown answers as we ought to be. And regardless of race, I think that's more an issue of income inequality and some of the other things that have been in place for a long time in the state that we've struggled with. And going back to the idea of people speaking, I know Good Shepherd Food Bank has been doing a really masterful job of supporting people who can then speak in the first person about hunger in their family, because it's very difficult for whether it's policymakers or community people to appreciate that there is in fact hunger in Maine. And there's always some judgment around why that is and what could be happening differently. And I think that whole issue of speaking in the first person is just so critical in terms of making it real. And I think that's what we're hearing folks saying here as well. We're getting ready to wrap. Are there some closing thoughts, things that you wish we brought up that we didn't, or final thoughts that you would like to share with the folks that are listening? Anyone?
Well, I will, I'll just echo a couple of things that I've heard. Really, really reinforce everyone's point, which is this is difficult. It's difficult work, but my thoughts would be to be inspired. Like we're clearer-eyed now in terms of where problems exist, and we weren't before. I just saw, like, this is the time of the US Open, and so I was watching, I believe last night, Naomi Osaka. She's a very inspiring player, and she is supporting some, like there was an advertisement on, and there was a tagline in the advertisement, and it was about, it said the difference between imagining the future and being the future or being in the future are the actions that we take in between. And so, I just thought about that. Like, if we are inspired and we can imagine the future, the difference between imagining it it and being there. It's to just do something. And so I would encourage all of us, even though it is really, really hard work, to say, you know, what will it take to make it happen? We're committed to that, and to be inspired. I don't mean to be Pollyanna about it, but to be inspired. This is a new time, and we can create a new future that is better for all.
Natalye, I can't think of a better way to wrap up this session than with that statement, because in these days we really do, it's not about being Pollyanna, it's just about having hope. And I think what you brought to that statement is just that sense of we can do it. And whether it's a small thing or a larger thing, every step is important. And so I want to thank all of you for being here today and being part of this conversation, and for all the work that you're doing. Because it is so critically important as we do become the future and work towards that. And I just really appreciate it. And I know the folks listening and at Volunteer Maine appreciate it as well. So thank you, everyone. This is the conclusion of our workshop on where volunteer engagement fits in the move to eliminate systemic racism as part of the 34th Maine Volunteer Leadership Conference. Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Thank you.